right. Well, thank you very much, Ethan, for the introduction, and thanks all of you for joining today. Yeah, my talk is going to be on the cost and benefits of AIS prevention in Minnesota and really moving those data points into an online usable dashboard. I want to begin, though, by first thanking the team. This has been a long-term, multi-phase project, and if you've attended showcases in the past, you've likely seen some of these folks presenting on this work with me, but just to give you a sense of the interdisciplinary nature and the different fields that have been brought together to work on this project, I've highlighted in red the students that have been a part of it. Zoe on the left, let's see if I can, right here. She has a PhD in public health, Kaushi in veterinary medicine, Megan in conservation sciences, and Nicole and Molly here on the top right are in water resource sciences. So a lot of different backgrounds, and it's been a lot of fun working with all these people. And I began most of these talks at the showcase you've heard me in the past probably ask you this same question, but it really is the origins of this work and really asking us, will AIS invade every lake? And as we think about the probability of that, I mean, not every lake in Minnesota is a good walleye lake or a trout lake, for example. So there's really no reason to believe that every lake is going to be great for starry stonewort or zebra mussels. So the answer is no. They won't invade every lake, likely. But the question is then, what are the predictable patterns to sort of forecast where they might go? What can we tell from its current invasion status to understand the potential future risk? Now, relatively straightforward concept, and there's been a lot of projects that have looked at this in a lot of disciplines, including invasion biology. But if you're not a manager yourself, consider being a natural resource manager and staring down the problem of hundreds of infested lakes, thousands more lakes that you're trying to protect, high-risk pathways like water connectivity going everywhere in Minnesota, 800,000 registered boats moving around the state, over 1 million anglers going out in Minnesota each year. It just becomes an overwhelming and complex problem to solve. So we were approached by managers and we worked for several years just to come up with the concept of this project. And our goal with them was to develop lake-level epidemiological models to inform decision-making that will slow the spread of aquatic invasive species, really understanding where invasive species are and where they could go in the future. Now, in past showcase presentations, I presented on some of these topics that you see here on the water connectivity, boat movement, environmental suitability. I'm not going to go into all those details here in this talk. I want to get to this last part that we've added in the last year on intervention strategies. But I will go through them quickly here on the next couple slides. And I'm happy to talk with you more in detail or in the Q&A or follow up by email, send you the papers and recorded talks, the background information if you want to know more. So these different data streams are all feeding into models. And you'll see where this is all going here in just a minute. But the first and really important data set that we use is the infested waters list managed by the Department of Natural Resources. This is the sort of the gold standard of where species are in the state. And that's sort of the step one in this whole process. We've used this infested waters list regularly. We check it all the time, every day. And every time it gets updated, we update our models automatically. They reappear online with the most recent updated infested waters list. We spent about 1.5 years developing connectivity networks for water movement in Minnesota. Connecting lakes with rivers and streams isn't a trivial task, and it took a fair bit of time. But we do have a pretty solid framework now for understanding where species might flow through natural movements. And we know that's a high-risk pathway for species like zebra mussels and downstream drift of aquatic plants. Boat movement, another high-risk pathway often implicated in the movement of species like zebra mussels, spiny water flea, Eurasian water milfoil, starry stonewort. We leveraged a huge data set from the watercraft inspection program that's administered by the Department of Natural Resources and counties in Minnesota. And among other things, as part of that inspection, they ask a few really important questions of where were you before and where are you going next? And of course, we know where they are at the time of the inspection. Now, those two data points on either end of where they are at the time, combined with everybody else's inspections, creates a huge, complex network of connectivity. Through a series of statistical models, we were able to fill in gaps, accounting for lakes that did not receive inspection effort, and accounting for bias in inspection effort across the landscape. So lakes that get a lot of inspections versus lakes that get very few. Long story short on this topic, we were able to fill all that in and create an estimated network of boat movement in the state. We're able to validate that, verify its accuracy, and are quite confident that we have a pretty robust model here to run simulations with. We can subset that network, this whole network of all boat movements, to those that we consider to be risky. And those would be boats that move from infested waters of any given species to uninfested waters. We don't care so much about boats, at least for the purpose of this approach, we don't care about boats that move from uninfested to uninfested waters. It's the infested to uninfested that are really important for management intervention, and are the focus of several of our models that I'll explain in a bit. And lastly, we combine these questions of could the species get there with the question of could it survive if it does? And we've done this for multiple species now using a variety of approaches, really asking what lakes are suitable for zebra mussels or starry stonewort. And we can categorize those lakes based on suitability, build that into the model as a predictor for whether or not the species could survive if it does get introduced. And so this has all been integrated into online models, and I've presented again on this in the past, and really answering sort of two problems that managers had. One, could we make the haystack smaller for surveillance? Which lakes should they prioritize if they're going to go look for new infestations? And the second model that we developed was an optimization approach for prioritizing where to put watercraft inspectors on the landscape. This is, again, a very mathematically complex question considering how dynamic and large the networks are. I'm not going to bore you with the equations here, and I'll ask for a little faith, and we're going to put all of this data and these models into this black box. And I'm going to just show you the outputs. But if you're curious to know more about the technicality, the code, the equations of any of these approaches, we have a bunch of papers and more in review right now that are coming out that walk you through the details of everything that I'm going to say. Again, happy to share. Most of these are open access. You can find them online for free, but if you want me to send you a PDF, don't hesitate to send me an email. So most of you have probably heard me talk in the past, or you're aware of the AIS Explorer. That's where these models that I just talked about are visualized. These are the places where we use all these data sources, we visualize the outcomes and allow users to interact with the outputs in ways to help answer local decision-making questions. So the first feature that's been online for a couple of years now is this application for introduction risk for surveillance. You can click on any given lake in the state that'll tell you the probability that that lake will become infested with zebra mussels or starry stonewort. You can click on the lake, get demographics about it, see what it's connected to and the degree of those connections. You can do this at the county level, tribal lands, a variety of ways to look at this, and you can download the spreadsheets and images relevant to your area. We've also, I mentioned this optimization models for prioritizing watercraft inspections. It's another application that's been on the AIS Explorer for a couple of years. Another sort of user-defined application where you can pick the species you're concerned about, your area of interest, and visualize outputs on the best bang for your buck for locating inspection effort. So hopefully nothing I've said so far is really new. I repeat it as a way of background for where we're going. And every year I've given these talks, I've told you that there's more coming. We're working on adding complexity and new features to this dashboard, and working on addressing some of the underlying assumptions that are inherent with the early models that we've come up with. And one of those big things that we've wanted to add, and it's taken us quite a while to get there, we're very excited to share it today, is adding interventions into these models. We know that these networks, at least the way they're presented online right now, are assuming pretty equal connections, sort of status quo management. But we know that if you put things on the landscape to reduce risk at any given lake, it's going to change the likelihood of spread from that lake to any other lake or into that water body. And there's a lot of options at our disposal, and you as managers could employ to sort of change that risk. And we know that there are trade-offs at both ends of the spectrum, from total unmitigated spread of everything going everywhere to more drastic measures where you invest enormous amounts of money and really try to isolate infested water bodies, the trade-offs with recreational use and all of that. So how do we have these conversations to evaluate this spectrum without testing scenarios in real life? Our goal was to further develop these models to incorporate interventions. But we had a lot of conversations with managers and with researchers across the country about which interventions might be used in Minnesota, at least which ones should we start exploring first. We spent a lot of time doing literature reviews and talking with experts about how effective the different interventions are. And we wanted to know the cost, really the cost benefit. So you could spend a lot of money doing something, but is it really going to provide the reward, that benefit downstream relative to a whole bunch of cheaper options? So I'm going to spend the rest of this talk really focused in on that effectiveness and cost question and show you how we've incorporated it. The effectiveness for the three interventions that we focused on, which is boater education, watercraft inspections, and hot water decontamination, they've been explored in the literature, but not in ways that are directly applicable in the real world here in Minnesota. So, for example, people have tested the effectiveness of hot water decon and inspections, but it's almost always been done with researchers acting as the professional with a boat that they've set up. They know where the things are, and they try to clean it. And there's been a variety of studies that have looked at approaches in slightly different ways to that. But what we wanted to do is to go out to public water access sites and just ask people, public boaters, professional inspectors and deconners, to clean a boat. We read them a script to elicit a boat cleaning. We told them that this boat had been in an infested water while we're standing there at the access points, but we did not give them any direction on how to clean it, how long to spend doing it, what tools to use, anything like that. So we asked these boaters and these professionals to basically do what you would normally do. We recorded their behavior and their ability to remove the AIS. We also conducted a survey after they finished their process to ask them about their experience, their education level with regards to AIS, their demographics, that sort of thing. Now, I'll caveat this by saying I know this is a experimental setup, and there's potentially bias, like observer bias, that somebody might try a little extra hard because they know a researcher is standing there watching them. That's unavoidable. And we spent a long time trying to think through how we might conduct this work to at least reduce that observation bias. But I think we came up with the best option here. And if anything, we'll assume that the results that we got would be considered best case scenario then. If people were trying extra hard, these are the best case scenario data for members of the public and professionals to do this work. To give you a sense of how we spiked this boat, we spiked it in the same way with the same amounts of things every time. So everybody saw the same thing, and we picked locations that literature and experts told us would be very common places or likely places for AIS to be found. We planted 6 locations on the boat with invasive plants. In this, there's a proxy. We used coontail instead of an actual invasive, so we didn't spread something. We used 2 locations to locate zebra mussel shells. We had preserved spiny water fleas on the end of a fishing rod. We know that's a high-risk location. And we had a bait bucket in the boat with some water sitting in it. And again, we asked these participants to find this boat, clean it, do what you would normally do. And I'll share with you next the results of what we found. So first, just to orient you to this figure, on the bottom, on the x-axis, we have the 3 different types of categories of groups we looked at: the boaters, inspectors, and decontaminators. And on the y-axis, the percent of the invasive species that they removed. So if they removed the AIS from 4 spots in the boat, that was a 40% removal rate. We also broke this out by region of participants, the Twin Cities metro region versus outstate, greater Minnesota. And you'll see some differences here in just a second. And I should point out this, with regards to decontamination, the decontaminators in this step, this was just their hand removal, their visual observation and removal by hand. It does not account for their hot water step, which we'll present on here in just a minute. So first, the boaters. We had 69 participants from across Minnesota that went through this trial. On average, they removed 56% of the invasive species on the boat. So not as high as some might hope, but it's definitely better than not doing anything. I think this is a good sign that boaters are generally aware of AIS and that they know how to remove more than half of the things that are on the boat. In comparison to inspectors, they had nearly 80% effectiveness, so significantly higher than boaters. We had 52 of those folks across the state, and we had 23 participants, 23 professional decontaminators with slightly higher effectiveness than the inspectors. Again, just with hand removal. And we saw this, this difference between the inspectors and decontaminators, although small, is likely because they spent more time looking at the boat than the inspectors did. And I'll come back to that point in just a minute. To give you a sense of the breakdown between parts of the boat and the AIS type, we saw some pretty big differences in what folks were able to find. People could see the bigger clumps of plants on the propeller and trailer frame, the roller. People found that anchor in the boat and saw that there were weeds on that and removed them effectively. But as you start to get into some other parts of the boat, especially with the boaters, they weren't able to find it at nearly the same rate. Zebra mussels were surprisingly low with the motor mount across all categories. The spiny water flea, no boaters found spiny water flea on the end of the fishing rod. And again, that's a high-risk area for spread of this emerging invasive species. And so it's an opportunity, I think, for targeted outreach on that front. Then the bait bucket, the water there, more than half of folks in all categories found that water and dumped it out. We saw a very clear trend, as you can see in this figure, that the longer somebody spent hand removing and visually inspecting the boat, the better they were in all categories. So if you move a boater, let's say, if you're working on an outreach program, instead of taking 2 minutes to clean your boat, spend 5. And you're likely going to double the level of effectiveness on average. Now, it's only a few minutes difference for a huge return. And that's a small tweak to messaging that managers could use in their outreach campaigns. Now for that hot water step of the decon. What we did here is we really wanted to understand the effectiveness. How good is decon really? We use the UMPS protocol. It's a standardized protocol that is used by the Minnesota DNR as part of their training for decontaminators. It's a protocol that many states use, and they use a threshold of 60 degrees Celsius for 10 seconds to kill adult mussels on most parts of the boat. It's a lower temperature for a longer duration in other parts. Now, this is a high bar, I'd say, and not necessarily all areas need to be treated to the same extent. But it is a threshold, and it is the recommendation that the boat gets cleaned in this way. So how do you actually evaluate this? This was a tricky thing. We spent a long time trying to figure out how to do that. And what we ultimately came up with is using a heat gun to monitor the behavior of deconners. And you can see in the top right, it records the temperature at that point where the water is being sprayed. And we want to see that above 60 degrees for at least 10 seconds on each section of the boat. And we can incorporate these videos into some software, and through a lot of work by Nicole, she was able to evaluate the effectiveness of decontamination. What we want to see here on these figures, so these are the results, and what we want to see are hotter temperatures. The whiter, the more yellow, the better. It means that more deconners were sufficiently treating that area. What you see are a couple interesting observations. As you go towards the front of the boat, it gets darker, meaning that deconners were treating those areas for less time or at lower temperatures compared to the back of the boat. And that makes sense from a risk-based perspective. That back of the boat, deeper in the water, likely to get more zebra mussels or other microbes that deserve the hot water treatment. A really important finding, though, that we figured out because we had this heat gun, and I don't know that too many people have looked at this in the past, is the sinuating temperature of the decon unit itself. Very often, and a big part of this pretty low effectiveness for decon is because not human error or a choice that the deconner was making. It's because the equipment doesn't stay at the right temperature very long. It goes up and then it comes down. It goes up and goes down below that important lethal threshold. And it was to the tune of 80% of the time, these decon stations or units were going below the appropriate temperature. They aren't designed for this purpose. They're designed for cleaning, and it's a different application. So it's something, if you have decon units, check them out. Watch that the thermostat on there and see how well it does at actually maintaining the right temp. The next piece of this puzzle is the cost question of these different prevention activities. We provided data from the Department of Natural Resources, from county level summaries, or county managers send them sort of annual updates on their prevention aid spending, and we were able to get a lot of information from there. We also followed up with about 20 county level inspectors to collect more detailed data on education and outreach expenses and inspection and decon expenses. And ultimately, we divided the total costs by the number of interventions that they make. And this is what we found. The cost for intervention on each boat or trip at the county level is about 40 cents, about $20 per inspection, and $360 or so for each decon. Now, there's some wide ranges here and a lot of variability in sort of what these numbers tell us, but it varies by county and individual lake, for example. But these are averages, and I'll show you where these numbers become important in just a few slides. So now we take the empirical data that we've collected through the experimental trials at boat ramps and the surveys with county managers, and we add this intervention box to this the underlying models that we already have. So imagine this huge, complex, interconnected network of lakes, And now we want to add interventions at various points to see how risk changes across the landscape. What is the cost and benefit of a user-defined intervention scenario? And again, here, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the equations, put it back in the black box, and go straight to the application of it. But this is a paper we're working on right now, nearing submission soon, and happy to share a draft with folks if you're curious to know more on the details. But if you've been on the Explorer recently, just launched 2 weeks ago is this new intervention impact application. So you can go on, it's live right now, and play around with this feature that I'm about to describe. Now, we've been talking about this for the last year and a half or so as like a dream, and it's finally come to fruition. This tool allows managers or other interested folks to walk through a series of steps to develop a management strategy and then visualize the reduction in risk or increase perhaps within their county or counties. You can select on this first tab the species you're interested in. Both zebra mussels and starry stonewort are included right now. We'll add more as we generate the underlying models. You can pick a county or multiple counties and the lakes that you want to include in this sort of scenario. On the next step, you define the effort for the different interventions for each one of those lakes. And you can have default settings for all applied to all lakes, or you can modify it based on individual lakes. Now, I'll point out one twist here that's will challenge some managers in the way you approach the effort question. I know a lot of you sort of think about effort with your watercraft inspection or decon as the number of hours spent at a boat ramp. That's hard. That's a hard number to incorporate into a model because it depends on how many people are there, which lake you're at, and all those sorts of things. So what this model does is looks at the number of boaters that you're actually intervening with. And so you'll have to sort of shift your mindset on how you count effort, but I'm happy to chat through that in more detail if that's confusing. The next tab here walks you through the effectiveness. And as default, as determined by those experimental trials, we have the numbers that I showed you before for the inspectors, the decounters, and boaters. Now, if you scroll down on this page, you can change the defaults for all lakes or any individual lake. If you think that the hot water decon is more effective than what we say, great, change it. And you can make that happen within these models. And same with the cost. These are the default settings as determined based on the county manager surveys. But if you think it's cheaper on any given lake because it's a really busy access, or it's more expensive because it's worth it to have one person there and not have a lot of traffic, change it at the lake level. This is really a choose your own adventure scenario with some seeds for ideas based on some data that we have. You can review the settings, and then ultimately, it's not as, because these are huge models underlying these scenarios, it's not as real time as the other applications on AIS Explorer. What this will do is send you an emailed HTML report. You can look at it as a PDF or as HTML file, which is interactive. So you can play around with the figures. It has maps incorporated that you can zoom in and out of. You can really see your outputs in a variety of ways. It breaks it down, hopefully in ways that make sense and are helpful for decision making. But if you've got ideas or questions or needs, don't hesitate to reach out. It's got a lot of information captured in there, the lake level changes and the likelihood of invasion based on your scenario. And you can compare the number of infestations that are predicted under a status quo condition versus whatever your user-defined intervention was. This helps managers sort of understand what might happen given any suite of decisions. Just taking a quick look at time. Okay, so I'll give you an example here of Crow Wing County, just sort of walking you through what this might look like. Now, I use this as a totally hypothetical example, and Cass County. And Cass County has been helpful in sort of taking a sneak peek at this and gut checking a few ideas, but this is totally hypothetical. It does not mean to suggest that Cass County should do or is doing anything, but this is just an example. And we're going to look at this. I'll reveal some more of the figure here in just a second, but I'm going to show you under normal effectiveness with our default settings and what things might look like if we assume lower boater effectiveness or higher decon effectiveness as alternatives to the status quo and sort of user-defined options. So our status quo model would suggest in Cass County 5 years from now, they're going to have about 16 more lakes infested with zebra mussels. That's what the model predicts. So what can we do to reduce that risk? What sort of intervention plan could be employed to help? And if we look at the spending scenario of spending about a $500,000 budget, their prevention aid dollars, 75% of that on inspections, 20% of their money on decon, and 5% of their money on boater education, we would expect a reduction of about 4 or 5 lakes will not become infested given this level of investment. However, if we increase the amount of money spent on boater education to 50 or 40% of the available funding, the number of infestations goes way down. This scenario would suggest that educating boaters can be a really cost-effective way at reducing risk on the landscape. Now, if we look at the other two, let's assume that boater education is not as good as we think. The number of infestations go higher than the normal effectiveness, and about the same if we assume that decon is more effective. And for the other scenarios, the patterns are pretty consistent. There's a huge influence of boater education and how effective we can make boaters on the overall outcome of risk. And that's a highly volatile variable here and something that managers ought to think about and start to better quantify their outreach campaigns and how strong or effective they really are through empirical studies. So the future directions, again, more to come. We really like this tool and we like building complexity and additions to these models based on user manager public feedback. So highly encourage you to reach out, send us your ideas. A few things that we have in the pipeline. We have folks are working right now on adding additional years of boater movement data. We know that there was a lot of, or we hypothesize, I guess, that there's a lot of change pre, during, and post-pandemic with regards to boater movement. A lot more boaters, and they're likely behaving in different ways. And we're going to add those data and do some inter-year comparisons to see what that might mean for risk. We're going to look at subnetworks of risk based on various boat types, because we know some boats are greater risk than others. We also are working with another team in Indiana using mobile applications and cell phone tracking data to complement the watercraft inspections to see if there are other patterns of spread that aren't being captured with the current models. We're also planning to expand our spatial scope with a variety of grants, federal funding to expand to Wisconsin, the Great Lakes region, and the Upper Mississippi River Basin in the next year or two. And we're going to continue as best we can with some manager consultation. We'll be hosting workshops in the coming months to similar to what we did with the AIS Explorer's early launch with these new features. So if you're curious to know more, please reach out and we're happy to walk through it one-on-one or with small groups. We're also going to be incorporating game theory and additional species and interventions as we can develop the underlying models and assumptions. So with that, I've got some contact information here, the email address for me and the website link for the AIS Explorer if you want to drive the tool yourself. And Ethan, if we've got time for questions, I'm happy to take a few.
Yeah, we have a few questions from attendees. There's one here that says, is there accessible data for costs for inspections and decons by county to reference, and how was that determined?
Yes, great question. So the data for the underlying cost data is going to be, some of it's already publicly available through the DNR summary level data, but the more detailed cost breakdown is going to be published as part of our paper right now. It's important to us that all of our data, our code, everything is publicly available and reproducible. So we'll make that available as part of the publication. I don't know exactly when that'll go live. It's got to work its way through the process, but either reach out to me, I'm happy to send it when it's ready, or stay tuned for more.
Thanks for that. Another question here. The recreational lakes in Hubbard County are still largely uninfested with zebra mussels. Do you have data that show why? Is it because of prevention efforts or suitability, or they just haven't gotten there yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what our models are pretty good at doing are showing what has happened and what will happen. It's not as great about sort of individual why it happened or why hasn't it happened. We have some predictors within the model that we know are influential, like watercraft, like connectivity through boat movement. So the more boats coming from infested lakes, the riskier you are. The closer in geographic proximity you are to an infested lake, the riskier you are. There are demographics about the lake, size, depth, clarity, for zebra mussels, calcium levels, that we know are all influential. Those are all pieces to a pretty complex puzzle. In that neck of the woods, it's very likely that it just hasn't got there yet, or those connections aren't as strong as they are in other areas. But it's definitely a part of the state that we would predict to be suitable if zebra mussels were introduced.
Another question we have here says, thank you for this enormously important predictive model. Would it be possible to add other potential interventions such as decontaminations leaving infested lakes or license restrictions / quarantine if a boat had been on an infested lake?
Yeah, so the way the interventions are applied right now is to all boats coming and going from any given lake. So boats that are coming in, it's a risk reduction on those inbound boats. Boats going out, it's a risk reduction to the lakes they're going to. So the interventions are applied at that lake regardless of whether they're coming or going. What's interesting about the model is, and you can play around with this if you go in there, the names of those interventions really are just placeholders for common intervention types. There is the ability to change the cost and effectiveness and location for any one of those interventions. So let's say you wanted to quarantine a lake, for example, or increase the effectiveness to near 100% for all boats leaving a lake or coming into it. You can do that and just ignore the type of intervention that it is and make up your own. So it's a flexible tool in that way to test a variety of scenarios with a variety of approaches. They're just under the names that we have right now because they're the most common. Hope that makes sense.
We have another question here. Your results, sorry, your results underline how important it is to educate voters. What research has MASERC done to understand what types of education give the largest benefit to their cost?
That's a great question, Josh. And I would direct you to, let's look at my schedule here. At 1:15 today in Web Room 1, there's going to be a talk, Beyond the Sign, observing angler behaviors to inform prevention message development. That's one that's looking at this more explicitly. What outreach might be most effective, how to deliver those messages, the type of messaging, as it relates specifically here in Minnesota. There's been other projects done outside of MASERC that have dabbled in that, and various degrees of qualitative and quantitative assessments and research out of the state that we could apply best guesses to right now. But we're going to continue to refine this messaging and understanding of it, given its importance to this important pathway.
A few more questions here. Will the paper address the differences in interventions in infested lakes versus lakes that aren't infested with AIS?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Not directly. That's an interesting idea. We haven't thought about how to incorporate that explicitly in the paper or how to break that out, but it's a good idea. I mean, it's something my wheels are turning right now, and how we could make that happen and sort of play around with different figures and the implications of different strategies on infested versus uninfested lakes. I mean, there's definitely a trade-off in management strategies between sort of a protection approach where you're trying to prevent introduction into uninfested lakes versus a containment approach where you're trying to contain the species where they're at right now. And that the trade-offs there vary greatly depending on the number of infested lakes and the number of lakes that are uninfested. But we could play around with different ways to evaluate that.
Will the list of available AIS to look at in this Explorer be expanded to include invasive species not currently featured on the infested waters list?
Yes, we can include, so the majority of these tools, the majority of the work has been focused on species that are likely to move through the boater pathway. So that's been the focus. There are some species, of course, that are very problematic and not on the infested waters list. Our limitation there is just available data and how to keep it updated. So curly-leaf pondweed, for example, has management implications. I don't believe it's on the infested waters list. And that, if we had solid data and reliable data that could be updated regularly, that is a species that we could add into these tools for sure. But something like common carp, for example, may not be well suited since it doesn't move through these similar pathways.
We have two more questions. Could the tool itself have the option to select just managing infested lakes?
Yeah, the tool, we do not have an automated, like sort of an automatic option right now, or a box to check to say just inspect or just apply interventions to infested lakes. But you can go through and manually select them. And depending on your county, that may be a small list or a long list. And it's just a matter of searching for that lake, clicking it, and adding it to the column for interventions. It's a relatively straightforward process, but a manual one at this point in time.
And our last question.
I say that because there might, and the reason we don't have sort of an automated feature there is because there are situations where there are uninfested lakes that are, from a sort of an optimization point of view, make more sense to sometimes apply an intervention at an uninfested lake than a infested lake that's not very popular. So there's trade-offs there that could or should be explored by managers.
Our final question, will there be workshops or one-on-one training for this new tool?
Yes, definitely. So I think I mentioned we'll be hosting a series of workshops like we did about 2 years ago for small groups, one-on-one with managers, county, tribal, state, DNR, watersheds, whoever. If you're an interested member of the public, you're more than welcome to join. Happy to walk through the mechanics of the model, the assumptions that it makes, how to input sort of locally relevant information, and then how to interpret the results and really use them. It'll be sort of this, it won't be this talk. It'll be one that's much more featured, much more focused on sort of the application usability of it. I can drop my name, or maybe Ethan, if you could drop my email or Maddie's email into the chat, that would be the two people to reach out to, and we'll get you on the list. But we will advertise through MACIRC's newsletter and send an email out to county manager or to local managers as well to ensure that folks who want to attend are hearing about it. Thanks, everybody.